describing the role of open science in addressing the issue of climate change. So Henry and also the panelists who will be part of this session to come up on the podium, please.
Can the panelists please? Hello, good morning. Can the panelists please come up? It's Vladimir, any order. Maybe Maria, you sit here. Where's Maria? Maria, sit here, and then we sit up there. Is it on?
Do you use the handheld or you want a mic around? We can arrange that also.
Stefan, can we put the first slide up so we can all see the panelists? Hello. Stefan, first slide. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to speak because what I learned in COP is you have to compete with a lot of other amazing things happening. I'm going to speak loud. So we have to shout in a way. Yeah. So first of all, I'd just like to say thank you very much to Masamba for having the vision to put this panel together, which I think is extremely important and very exciting, and you're going to see we have a spectacular panel to address the issue of open science. For me, it's the first time at COP. I'm completely inspired at how 100,000 people care enough about the planet to fly from all over the world to be here. Extremely encouraged to see that most people, I think everybody, understands we need a revolution in policy making. We need a revolution in behavior. We need a revolution in social. And we need an industrial revolution. What I'm confused about is why action item number 1 is not ignite the scientific machinery. We did that in COP, with the COVID, sorry. We did that. And in 1 year, science solved the problem. After that, we locked back the science. We opened the science in COVID. And then we've locked it back up again. Why do we not open it in the future? So we are facing, this is the greatest endeavor of humanity. And we only really have 27 years to solve this problem. 27 years. The challenge is enormous. We have to go from here, and it looks like a free fall down to there. It's a huge, huge challenge. And I think that what we realize is that a lot of people, we don't always, just to remind us a little bit how powerful and important science has been to modern society, let's just, okay. I'm going to come back to that slide. If we look at just the lives saved, and yes, this is a problem now, fertilizer, but it saved a lot of lives. Higher yield crops saved, smallpox saved 500 million lives. Polio, COVID vaccine, blood transfusions, 1 billion lives. Antibiotics, 200 million lives. Anti-malarial drugs, 50 million lives. Bifurcated needles, something as simple as that. Genetic mapping.
I am absolutely convinced we will get to a low-carbon, no-carbon economy.
Can we put it louder?
What I'm not convinced of is that we will get there in time to avoid what the scientists have warned us of, which is the worst consequences of crisis.
So that's really the issue. Science can do it, but are we going to get there in time? The other confusion we have when we say we need innovation cycle, we need a lot of innovation. We need innovation from policy all the way to social, to behavior, industrial, technological. But sometimes we get confused or we mix them. Do we need new science? Or do we need science to help us take the existing solutions and get them deployed? We heard from Johan Rockström yesterday that the potential is enormous for taking existing knowledge and applying it and deploying it worldwide to solve it. And that is absolutely something that needs to be accelerated, and it can be accelerated. If we have all the data access, you can accelerate the application. AI is actually on that side of the innovation cycle to apply our knowledge in a better and better way. But we also need new science. We need a lot of new science. We will not have green cement or steel without new science. We don't know how to do that today. We will not have non-pollutive materials and plastics without new science. We will not have green electricity. We use lithium batteries for our electrical cars, but it's not green. We do not actually know today how to produce perfectly green lithium batteries. That needs new science. You can go across the board, and we're going to go through all of them, but you do need new science to make a difference on Bill Gates' chart of what are the biggest polluting differences. Even for keeping us warm, we need new science, how to create new kinds of heat pumps that will do it. So open science is needed for both new science and for applying science. Now, the problem that we have is actually more severe than we've realized. If you have to pay to read a scientific article, do you think that you open science or do you close science? Well, you know, my good friend Fred Fenta over there, who's from the Frontiers, reminded me, it does not take a neuroscientist, I'm a neuroscientist, it does not take a neuroscientist to realize what would happen if I slow down the communication between neurons in the brain. What would happen? We would just slow down. We would speak slowly. What would happen if I go and isolate groups of neurons in the brain? I would get Alzheimer's disease. Our current scientific machinery is hamstrung. It's handicapped. To appreciate it, we need to understand what is this scientific machinery. We have about 10 million scientists in the world today, across all areas, going to history. It doesn't matter. They're all contributing to the scientific engine. About 10 million scientists. There's about 50 million supporting staff, if you wish, technical supporting around the 10 million scientists. There are about 1 billion students in science. And then there are probably around 2 billion entrepreneurs, practitioners, innovators in the global south, sitting in a little village somewhere in the world. If we ignited the brain, the collective brain of the 10 million scientists here and all these different rings, almost anything is possible. It took, for the digital revolution, it took about 20, 30, 40 years before computers and then the internet. But when the internet started penetrating the planet, our GDP skyrocketed from about 30 trillion to 100 trillion in 20 years. We can do that faster if we had to open the science, ignite the scientific machinery, and get to solve these challenges much quicker. So the problem that we have today is that most of the science you have to pay to read. That means that your doctor cannot read about the latest science. That means that a climate innovator in Africa or anywhere else in the world cannot read about the latest innovation in science. And here, this is what we really need to do. We need to ignite the collaboration so that this becomes a collective brain that starts working at a top speed. We did it with COVID. In 1 year, we solved the problem scientifically. There are many other cases. We do not need to keep the science locked up. There's health cases where, when it comes to respiratory diseases, 500 million cases a year. The governments are realizing it. This is Joe Biden's cancer initiative, where he says the only way we're going to get to solving cancer is if we open the science. Now, the problem is this. If you look at climate research papers, this is the access to climate research papers, climate science that can save us. This is the access level that the world has. It's the same as shutting down the internet for scientists. So Nature, the Nature article, this is the top science. This is the breakthrough. 8% of it is open to the world to read. Lancet, 5%. Science magazine, 0.4%. We have from the World Health Organization here, New England Journal of Medicine, key discoveries in how medicine can help us, 0%. How do we want to address these major challenges when we lock up the science? So we have an amazing panel here today to address the issue of how important it is in our different fields. And we have Maria here today to help us understand how to get science at the top of the COP agenda. It's action item number 1. It is free to get. It's not going to cost trillions. It just is going to cost a mandate to say that all publicly funded science must be open. That's all. And Maria, we're going to ask you if you can help us with that. So I put up here on this slide some of the value propositions. Why do we need open science? How it can help us in innovation, how it can help us in healthcare, how it can help us in business, and how it can help us in policy making. And I will now go to the panel and ask, and maybe, Maria, before we start with you, how we solve it, let's go first to Lars from the World Meteorological Organization to tell us how important he sees open access and to science is. Open science means open access to the scientific papers and to the data. Lars.
Thank you very much, Henry. Yes, what I would... Can you hear me? Okay, I just need to hold a little bit closer. Yes, open access to the scientific results are vitally important, but you mentioned something else, namely open access to the data, which is incredibly important for climate and for weather prediction. So, open science often means that you publish your results and you give enough information so that a different research group can repeat your experiments and verify your results. What we do, well, you could say we are conducting a climate experiment by all the greenhouse gases that we are letting out. But experimentation in meteorology are not repeatable. The atmosphere never repeats itself. So what open science means to us is that when you acquire weather and climate data, and you try to draw conclusions from them, whether it is about, you can use today's data to predict the weather a week from today, or you can use the last 30 years climate data to try to understand how much climate has changed and try to project how much it will change in the future. Those data need to be made available to everybody around the planet because only that way can we verify each other's predictions and projections, and only that way can we learn how to do a better job. So this is vitally important. We have a long tradition for doing that in meteorology. So I'm getting up there toward the end of my career. I've been an atmospheric scientist for 35, 40 years. When I entered the field in the late 1980s, I was working for a National Weather Service in the research department. I was not a weather forecaster, but I was a user of weather forecast. And I can tell you, I was a sailboat racer, and I can tell you that there was no skill in weather forecast at the time beyond 24 hours in my native Denmark, where I was racing sailboats. Now, a few decades later, most of you will plan your lives around weather forecasts. 7-10 days ahead, you can say, this is trivial. Do I need to bring an umbrella or not? This is not a world-changing breakthrough. But it has led national economies and the private sector to make incredibly important decisions. I'm a co-author of a paper published by the World Bank that shows that what this brings into the global economy, just based on weather prediction, is about $150 billion a year. Just for weather prediction. So the return on that investment is phenomenal. And this is built on open data. What this would mean for climate change mitigation is a lot more difficult to quantify. You get into trying to answer a really tricky question. What is the economic benefit of avoiding World War III, for instance? I mean, there are enormous potential impacts of climate change. And we need to apply the same open science and open data culture to climate change and climate change mitigation that we have applied very successfully to weather prediction. We are not quite there yet, and this is one of the things that I would like to see happening at this COP. We were discussing with a couple of my fellow panelists just before we got into the room, and I was talking to Maria about this. It's not just about making the science open, it is also about opening up, making the COP parties receptive to it. So there are things that need to change on both sides of the equation. We can do better in terms of open science. I think Henry mentioned one of the keys here. One of the last things you said is a statement that resonates very strongly with me. And when we had a discussion about data policy in the World Meteorological Organization a couple of years ago, we had, this was in the middle of COVID, so we had a data conference, almost all virtual, with about 1,500 participants, national government, scientists, the private sector, etc. And one of the conclusions that we came out with was actually verbatim what you just said. Any science, any data that are publicly funded need to be made openly accessible. It's a very, very simple statement. The logic is easy for everybody to understand, but we are not there yet. We are simply not there yet, but I think that message is vitally important. The second message that I would that I would like to come out of this COP here in particular is that the parties, the negotiators who are here, will go back and look at the text of the Paris Agreement, which says that climate change mitigation and adaptation should be built on the best available science. So be open to the scientific input that we give you. You may not always like it because it may drive decisions that are somewhat painful for you, but I think there is a role for party negotiators as well. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much, Henry.
Thank you very much, Lars. Vladimir, so from the perspective of the oceans, absorbing most of the CO2, but also the source of food and livelihoods. How do you see the importance of open science in coming up faster with solutions for the oceans?
I think my microphone's supposed to... Do you hear me now? Lovely. No? Okay, so, you know, it's usually I'm illegible, so it's okay. You know, I think, let me speak using the mic. So, you know, I think I need to start with one quote from one prime minister. I'm not going to name the country, it will be embarrassing. So, people elected us, they voted for us. So we shaped the government, we formed the government. We care about our people. Why do we need scientists? That was a very famous statement of one prime minister. And I think this to some extent still reflects the situation in the decision-making system in the world. The decision-making system is not capitalizing on science. In the ocean science, you know, and my position is basically to be chief oceanographer, is to make sure that science is developed and science is used. World Meteorological Organization, there is a special United Nations Convention. So according to that convention, data has to be produced at regular intervals, it has to be standardized, data have to be exchanged, meteorological products need to be developed. Now we can enjoy the weather prediction even for longer terms. Nothing exists of this sort in oceanography. So we had to reorganize the whole world. So the whole thing, what we were able to do basically, United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. And we have now around 50 different programs in the ocean science, focusing on sustainable development, also focusing on climate. So we kind of overcome to some extent the resistance of the governance system. But at the same time, our guidance is not used by the government. Sometimes it's not convenient, sometimes they have no resources, sometimes they have other priorities. So it also have to be somehow conveyed. And there is a big struggle always in the climate convention. First of all, 2015, the Paris Agreement was signed. We were only able to make sure that the world ocean, marine ecosystems, is included in the preamble of the Paris Agreement. Now it's more and more going into the main discussion. Think how to move the capacity of science forward, and the United Nations Education, Science and Cultural Organization. What UNESCO is doing, which is almost to follow the decisions of our guidance to the world is developed a definition of ocean science. We said that the ocean science is open availability of information, availability of infrastructure, and we also do this in the ocean. We try to understand what is the capacity of ocean science and whether the science is equitable, whether the science is available to countries. And we recently produced a map of the world in which we either increased or decreased the size of countries according to the number of publications. On this map, there is no Africa. Africa is unable to produce scientific information and unfortunately unable even sometimes to benefit from existing science. This is what Henry mentioned. So basically, recently I gave a talk to the Diplomatic Club of Geneva on what is happening in the ocean, what is the role of ocean science. And the president of the club said it's very important how we turn into decisions. And my response to this was, Mr. President, look at the decision-making system of this world. Do you see big differences with Middle Ages and now? Not really. So I think science has taken us here, And I think now the time has come to use the power of United Nations, use the recommendations of UNESCO to open the science and make the science help us basically to solve all the problems. COVID was excellent in that sense, you know, and the human nature is that we go to the end of the cliff. When we see this at the end of the cliff, we do something. And in terms of climate, we are at the end of the cliff right now. So this is what we do, and we really thank Frontiers for kind of revolutionizing this thing and helping our case. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. If we think of the case of COVID, just imagine if all that data on what was happening was open to the World Health Organization or to doctors around the world. How much it would have accelerated the treatments and equity in dealing with cases. So, Gavin, in the case of data, Gavin is the master of looking at data and tracing. How do you see that having open access to data can give us more equity in terms of data-driven decisions?
So for context, I come from more of a private sector background. I work at an NGO called WattTime, and we're part of a coalition of about 100 collaborating organizations. Started with Google.org, looking at how can we free up emissions data. And the context is that we've realized...
Just speak like this, apparently there's my...
Oh, am I too quiet?
You got to like point it straight, like a singer.
Thank you.
You're a performer now.
Can you hear this now? Okay, apologies. So I have a bit more of a tech sector background, and essentially at Climate Trace Coalition, we've got 100 different universities, tech companies, and NGOs really using open science to monitor global emissions. I think one of the things that we've really learned is that there's a lot more understanding in the private sector of the importance of open science and of what it means to have new science pointing to faster, cheaper, better ways to reduce emissions. And so just as one example, we have had a lot of companies that are steel producers donating data for the first time, opening up data that has always until now been held as secret information. And then we have researchers taking those data about how clean different steel facilities are and sharing them in an AI algorithm trained with free data from NASA, the Chinese National Space Agency, and the European Space Agency, and able to say when we combine all of this data, some of which was private until now, we can now see for every steel mill in the world which ones are cleaner. And why is this interesting? Because for this particular example, we've found that you could save 1 billion tons of emissions just by using the cleanest facilities already that are not fully getting used. You don't need to have any new innovation, no new capital, it's essentially free. That's 1 billion tons of a year of emission savings. That's 2% of climate change right there with a single innovation. And I think what we learned is that this approach is highly, highly scalable. In electricity, we've had a very similar breakthrough by having corporations donate data that was not previously public on what are the emissions of specific individual power plants. By matching that with power grid information that was not previously public about what's happening at that power grid at that time, and by combining that with satellites and AI, what we are able to do is to say if you use electricity at a particular place and time, what will the pollution difference be? And that meant it was possible to deploy on 500 million devices in a single year technology to charge them at times that is coming from renewable energy. So it turns out there's a large amount of renewable energy going to waste, solar and wind facilities that are turned off because there was not enough public information about which times are cleaner. And so I just sort of wanted to talk about the speed using this COVID example. This was all free collaboration. It's private sector, but companies are not getting paid for this. They're doing it because they really believe in the value of open contributions to find new ways to monitor emissions and make it faster to reduce emissions. And in 12 months, we went from 10 million to 500 million electric vehicles, smart thermostats, and batteries optimizing on renewable energy. The technical potential of innovations like that is another 1 billion tons right there. That's another 2% of climate change. We have no idea how far these examples can keep going, but what we think is that as more and more of us are sharing data and making it possible for everyone to see what are the emissions opportunities right here, right now, that don't cost anything, we can make it easier for us to actually achieve that incredibly ambitious goal. And I think what has been really surprising for me is for the private sector to embrace open science with no business model. Because the new normal is a lot of companies are very interested in going green if they can do it in ways that are cheap and fast. And I think policymakers should really take note of how willing many corporations, not just in the global north, all around the world, really are willing to do their part if we can just provide enough open science and data to make it simpler to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gavin. I mean, this is just such an important point. I think, can you imagine the millions of SMEs around the world that have R&Ds, small R&Ds, and the big R&D centers and the big corporations, if they had access to the latest knowledge and the latest data, what kind of acceleration could come from that? But to move to demand, the COVID was just a taste of what's to come, in a way. It was a warm-up for the world. And we succeeded a lot of things. So we made the science open. An unprecedented thing happened in COVID. I don't know if everybody is aware of it, but first of all, the data was made open. The Chinese immediately put the code out there, but a lot of other data was made open. The second thing that happened is that a core 19 data set was created, and governments and publishers agreed to, for that purpose, for that emergency, open all the scientific papers. So today there are about 1 million scientific papers. When it started, there were about 50,000. Within a year, there were 400,000 scientific papers related to SARS in this database. This gave access to everybody about what's going on with the virus and the disease. An incredible success. But the one thing that we maybe would agree that we did not do well at is equity in deployment of solutions. So, Diamant, from the World Health Organization, how do you see the challenge of inequity when supply chains are going to break down, food shortages happen, human and animal migration starts, geopolitical unrest, and nations start withdrawing internally to make sure that they have what they need? Do we see a big challenge there, and how can open science help?
Thanks. You haven't given me an easy question, I have to say. And thanks. So, yeah, my name's Dermot Campbell-Endrum. I lead the Climate Change and Health Program at WHO and have done for the last 20 years or so. And I think you're a neuroscientist. As I've listened to the other panelists, I've been feeling a kind of schizophrenia about the optimism for science and open science to address the problems that we have. And I think the introduction you gave is the flip side of the coin as to why it's not an entirely rosy picture, because everything that we try and do with science, and the COVID example is an excellent example, happens in a political and a social context. And that was one of the great learnings of COVID. And as you say, in many ways, it was an absolutely phenomenal success. I remember in those first uncertain early weeks of the COVID pandemic, people giving the examples of how long it's always taken us to develop a new vaccine. And it was typically a decade or so. And that came further and further forward in time until we had one effectively within a year. As we say, the world got an A in science, and then we got an F in ethics, because we were not able to deploy all of those interventions ethically around the world. And I think that's one of the big, for me, that's the fundamental challenge. As we ramp up the machine, as you say, to make everything, ideally make everything more connected and faster, we have to recognize the real-world barriers to the effective utilization of that. Amongst other things, I'm an IPCC author. I've been on 3 IPCC reports. If people ask me what's in the IPCC AR6, I tell you it's, the conclusion is, we've told you this 5 times already. The headline conclusion of how bad it is, it's human-induced and so on, has been out there for a very long time. The challenges that we have are the deployment and the focus on the solutions to solve the problem, rather than an increasingly detailed and scary depiction of all of the things that you've just described, the impacts of climate change occurring against a background of other risks. So, you know, I think the other thing to say about this is we shouldn't fool ourselves that it's just technological advance that will solve this. We have, you know, everything you've just described about the need for new science is absolutely correct. Yeah, we need solutions for concrete, steel, and so on. But we also have to open our minds quite a lot as to what we mean by science, because when we discuss this a little bit outside, you know, in many cases we do have technologies. In fact, we have technologies which are cheaper, cleaner, and healthier than the ones we're using today. Technologies that would save us money. So the decarbonization of the global economy, I understand that that would pay back in terms of reduced energy bills within 6 years. If you take into account the health gains that would come, mainly from improved air quality, that repayment time is about 6 months. So there's no scientific reason why we can't do it. There's no economic reason we can't do it. It's not that we don't have the answers, it's that we don't have the sort of the governance systems that focus the world on the problems and addressing the political barriers, the economic barriers, the communication barriers in order to do that. So I'm putting all that out there as sounds like sort of negative context, but the other, coming back to the other side of my schizophrenia, I think that you're absolutely right that science is the ultimate reference, and you're right, it should be number one in the COP process, and in a way it is. Everything is referred back to the IPCC. I have another source of reference for this, which is that the thing which has, I think, moved the climate change discussion more than anything else within the last few years, I believe, is the Fridays for Future movement. That was ground up, but the reference point for Greta Thunberg was obey the science, refer back to the science. So we always take the science as the reference point. And but then I come back to your central point about the importance of open science, because as you said, even in the COVID experience, a lot of the data was out there. You know, the sequencing was out there. There was the potential for anybody to have used those data to develop a new vaccine and to have done everything else. And if we were more open about it, and if we had more support to building capacity in low and middle income countries to utilize this, then it wouldn't have mattered so much that companies hung on to patents and that interfered with the equity issue. So my call is just to think about open science in that challenging political and economic context.
Thank you very much, Ivan. To come to Maria, but before that, I'd just like to, I think another, from a scientific perspective, another thing that was a shocking revelation in the COVID was actually the numbers on the lack of trust in science. I don't know, when you see that 50% of people did not believe in the vaccine, the solution, that, so if we're going to have scientific solutions and we want to deploy them in the world, or technological solutions, we want to deploy them in the world, and there is a world out there that doesn't believe in the science, how do we do that? And especially, how do we think we can get trust in science if the science is locked up? Does it? But a further question related to that is, what does it mean that the science is really open? So we have a lot of opinions. We have the social media. We're struggling with what's truth. And the reason why the science is at the core of the COP agenda, but I think what's not at the core is the ignition of the scientific engine. I think science is clear that we've got to have science-based decisions. But the reason why it is at the core of the agenda is because it kind of cuts through all the options and says, this is data-driven. And that's, but even if we achieve that, we still need the trust in the science. And can we get the trust in science without open science? So Maria, how would you react to that?
Well, thank you very, very much. And thank you to the Frontiers Foundation. I think this is a great initiative. I am here not because I am a scientist, but I fully support the Open Science Charter. I think it's a brilliant idea. I am more a practitioner, a policymaker, and I'm not ashamed to say that, a politician. And I hear you and learned a lot, but I have to say three things. Well, first an anecdote. I studied geography, and I remember my neighbors in New York when I was, going to university for the PhD and all of that. And every day they would cross in the corridor and ask me, "Is it going to rain tomorrow?" It's as if, the common understanding of what a geographer is about knowing if it was going to rain or not the next day, or snow. For that matter, which means that we need more open science in a way. And you spoke about trust, and I think it's critical. But I would like to make three comments after listening carefully. Except our colleague from WHO, we couldn't follow because of the sound and the microphone. I don't know if this is working, actually.
Yes, it's good.
Is it working? Okay. So the number one issue is that you said, and I capture that, we have to define what science is first. And when you look at nature, at how ecosystems work, they do not work in silos. And the Western approach is to look at the biodiversity science, the ocean science, separately the climate science, and we have bodies that work and produce knowledge on these different fronts. Knowledge about wetlands, about extinction, about air pollution. And I think that we need to double down on the earth science cross-disciplinary collaboration part. And that's a very important part of the open science, I would say, formula. That's one of the reasons why we need that cross-scientific collaboration to better understand what is happening with the Earth system. When I work in different spaces with Johan Rockstrom, as you know, basically the idea is to look at the planetary boundaries and how we go about that, and how we understand what are the limits to our growth and to our production and consumption patterns to stay, below the carrying capacity of our ecosystems. So the cross collaboration, the cross-disciplinary exchange is critically important. The number two is the equity part you also mentioned. We say that the COVID science collaboration was a success. We were able to develop a vaccine in 1 year. At the time, I was serving the Lancet Commission on COVID-19, and I learned a lot. And it was true. When the vaccines were developed, that was a different world altogether. Because then we saw, vaccine hoarding by some countries, continents like my own in Latin America or Africa not having access to the vaccines. So the second big issue is about how science is funded. And how science becomes a commodity, because you are successful according to the number of patents you get and the intellectual property rights you get over the scientific knowledge you produce. And when science becomes technology, it's even worse in terms of access for developing countries. That is a very difficult discussion. I remember in my past lives working for IUCN, the discussion on the TRIPS agreement, the trade-related intellectual property regimes, regarding genetic resources, for example. It's a major issue because, it really affects and impacts the access to knowledge and science from the developing countries, and that's an issue that needs to be factored in. The number three issue is what we see here in this panel. These incredible, talented people, but I'm the only woman and the only person from the Global South in this panel. And that's also a challenge, I would say, and luckily I'm here, I'm very happy. And that's what the STEM sector looks like. You know, scientists are mostly men and mostly from the global north. So this also has to change because we are speaking about democratizing science. So it is also about more women in STEM, but more women in STEM having voice and having power to say what they need to say. And the other critical issue is regarding thinking that science only, the cutting edge science only happens in the wealthy countries of the North. And it's not true. You know, there is incredible science that is being crafted, developed, innovated in countries of the global South, even in small countries like my own, especially regarding, for example, climate science-related innovation. There's a lot happening in the global South. So that also has to be with the democratizing of science. And perhaps my last comment would be, yes, we do need to inform policies by cutting-edge scientific developments. It is true, the Convention on Climate Change says that, the Paris Agreement says that, all multilateral environmental agreements basically say, take decisions according to the newest and better science. And it's true. The problem is a problem of communication between diplomats, practitioners, and scientists. You mentioned that there are 100,000 people here at COP, and it's true. And it shows that the world is scared, and they all want to come here and see what their future is going to look like, and it's a good sign. But among the 100,000, you know that there are 650 scientists that are here, if I'm not mistaken, 650,000. So, in the rest, you know, we are activists, civil society, you know, members of perhaps academia, civil society organizations, the private sector. But yet again, the scientists are underrepresented, as they are, and science is underrepresented when the negotiations are taking place. So we need to close the gap between science, policy, diplomacy, and politics as well. Thank you, Nova.
Thank you very much, Maria. Yeah, I think that open science can expand the workforce of science, not just we should do it for inclusive in women or in regions, but also involve the young minds, the young children that have a different view and more creative views. And so there's a huge potential for that. But just to summarize, so that we can go through in the last words, I'd like the panel to think about how do we get, we understand that science is a key in the science-based decision-making is a key principle of the COP. But I think we're saying something more, is that we have to ignite the scientific engine because we don't have time. We have to do it faster. And I think what we need to appreciate is that the scientific engine, this core 10 million scientists, they're actually funded by about 2.5 trillion that's 2.5% of GDP. But they're sitting on top of a resource that's probably several hundred trillions worth. So they're sitting on the most powerful base of technology and products and machines and materials and infrastructure, 25,000 universities around the world, 1 billion students around the world. How do we ignite that scientific machinery to get us there faster? Not just say, oh, we're waiting for science and we must rely on science. I see that as a passive. Let's rely on science. Let's drive science. So how would you suggest or recommend, how do we get that to action item number 1 on the COP agenda? We can start maybe, well, we start with you, dear Mark.
Well, time is short. I'll be very fast, and I'll make sure you can hear me. Thank you. Okay, it's been a long COP. I'm going to finish up with a joke. which hopefully is informative. If you don't laugh, it's a story, it's not a joke. But it's about this interaction between policymakers and scientists. And I think for me, the key answer is ask questions that answer the questions that policymakers want answered, and that will actually enthuse the scientists. The story is this: there's a woman walking across a field, and a hot air balloon starts floating overhead. And the woman in the hot air balloon calls down, "Where am I?" The woman on the ground calls back up, "You're in a hot air balloon." The woman in the hot air balloon calls down, "You must be a scientist." He says, "How did you know?" He says, "Because you've given me an answer which is technically correct but practically useless." And then the person on the ground calls back up and says, "You must be a politician." And the woman in the balloon calls down, "How did you know?" He said, "Well, you're in exactly the same position you were in 5 minutes ago, but now somehow it's my fault." So this is what we need to have, is a serious dialogue, I think, between the questions that politicians and society wants answered, because they're the ones that should enthuse the woman on the ground.
I think it's worth saying that much of the themes we've been discussing today have been happening for a very long time. But I think one thing that is new is AI really is changing how science works in the economic and policy angles. And I would say increasingly anyone who is staying out of the open science game is going to have a competitive disadvantage. So I would say even for folks who are not thinking just how do we reduce emissions, but thinking how do we make sure that my country, my institution is part of that, I think increasingly to not collaborate scientifically is going to mean that you are losing out on the best technologies and the best resources, and that will increasingly be a dangerous thing to do. So I think something worth thinking about is the benefits to yourself of being part of the open scientific change, particularly as AI makes that more economically important.
Wonderful. Vladimir?
Thanks, Henry.
Put the microphone.
Microphone. I'm touching. I'm almost kissing the microphone. So.
Yeah, but it's the angle that matters.
All right. Do you hear me now? Okay. So I think the ball is rolling. I have to say that, for example, in a couple of weeks, UNESCO is going to release an outlook on open science, and this is an analysis of where we are. With moving of open science forward for the world, and there are advances. Can only speak for oceanography now. Maria, so the decade of ocean science for sustainable development, 56% of participants are women. So this is the new science. In the decade we have programs on ocean and empathy, leadership of women in ocean science. And it's not about semi-Lagrangian techniques of wave prediction. It's very human science. But human science also learns how to speak. And I have to say that we need to mainstream the science. And we have now clear understanding how much money is going to science. For example, in the ocean domain, 1.7% of global expenditure in research and development goes to ocean matters. 70% of the air of the planet, 1.7% of the resources. So we need to change that. So the message of United Nations Environment, UNESCO, and many other organizations is clear, because now we are monitoring the science, we consciously moving science into more equitable dimension, and I think this will change the world the sooner the better.
Thank you, Vladimir. Lars?
Thank you. Very interesting discussion.
You have to shout, Lars.
Yeah. Can you hear me? I think we are actually doing a relatively good job with igniting the science. There are a couple of things that I think are still missing in this particular context. Maria mentioned both of them. There's an incredible amount of climate science out there, but it is not here. At the most important climate meeting, arguably, of the calendar. You mentioned 650 scientists out of 100,000. I actually thought there were fewer here. I have been very surprised at, this is my third COP, and the first one especially was a shocker. There was talk about this incredibly difficult scientific problem and very few scientists to inform the discussion. So I think we need to break down that particular wall. The second problem that you mentioned is equity, and it is not completely decoupled from it. Henry, you mentioned 25,000 universities around the world. I think maybe 24,000 of them are where the money is being made. And there are things that are called university in many developing countries that are actually not accredited by the wealthy countries of the world. So I think we have a huge problem there, and this is another wall that needs to fall. Through global collaboration on science, and we actually don't have that today. We have collaboration between Western Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, East Asia, basically the areas in the world where the money is made, and there are entire continents that are more or less excluded from that, and I think that is a problem that I would like to see changed.
Thank you. Maria, last word for us.
3 headlines. Number 1, look at non-Western science and traditional knowledge, especially when we speak about earth sciences. Number 2, look at the political economy of science. I think it's extremely important to see how it's funded, how it's legitimized, the issue of trust that you mentioned, and the issue of power and the relationship of justice, equality, and democratizing of science. And number 3 is the pedagogy of science and how to make sure that diplomats, policymakers, and decision makers are more aware of the science. I mean, the idea of the microphone not working was a metaphor to what is happening here and in the world. I mean, we cannot be heard properly. You, as scientists, we cannot be heard, and there is a translation effort that needs to be made. Even for the IPCC reports, ask how many of the negotiators have read in their entirety the IPCC report. Not many. So we need to do some science literacy to the diplomats, to the negotiators, and to the political leaders as well.
Thank you very much. The one thing that we're doing is asking everybody and all your network to sign the Open Science Charter, because all it takes is for universities to say, make the science open, governments to say, make publicly funded science open, and it's not something that will cost. In fact, we show that it will save universities about 7 billion. I would really like to thank the panel, an amazing panel, for your comments. And let's hope that the next COP has a huge pavilion all about the science that is needed to save the planet. Thank you.